If you were a poor, gentle little lab mouse with no future, the first time you opened your eyes, you didn't see a warm burrow or soft grass. Instead, you saw a sterile cage filled with the stinging smell of disinfectant. As a lab mouse, your first few weeks were surprisingly comfortable. Food arrived on time, water was plentiful, and your bedding was changed daily. Life was almost intoxicatingly pleasant. Occasionally, you noticed humans staring at you with notebooks, looking genuinely interested in your existence. But by the third week, your days of comfort came to an end. A gloved hand reached into the cage, grabbed your tail, and took you somewhere for weighing, measuring, and stimulation of your private parts. You didn't know then that this humiliation was just the appetizer to a much larger tragedy. One morning, you were moved to a new cage labeled Control Group. There you watched your cage mates being injected with drugs. Life became a cycle of endless repetition. You wandered between boredom and fear. Human attention began to fade. Sometimes they forgot to refill your water. Your new cage mates developed a nasty habit, biting your tail. Weeks later, you were reassigned to another experiment. This time, you weren't a passive observer. You officially joined a test for memory-enhancing drugs. Ironically, you wished you could forget what came next. Every day, they put you in a maze, hoping you'd remember the path to the cheese. But it wasn't a reward. It felt more like an insult. Every failed attempt led to a higher dosage. Your heart raced not from excitement, but from the fear the drugs induced. Months passed. You finally mastered the maze, but you felt more hopeless than ever. Your reward was only more experiments. Now you were the star subject for stress response research. Next came electrical stimulation tests. Moderate voltage reminded you that relaxation was not on today's menu, nor tomorrow's. Then came immune response trials. They exposed you to pathogens to observe how your small body reacted. Sneezing, fever, and constant discomfort became your new normal. If you were still alive, you'd soon be forced into sleep deprivation tests. Bright lights, shrill noises, and endless stimulation made rest impossible. Your fur thinned, your whiskers drooped under constant stress. You looked increasingly worn down. You had no friends, only electrodes and a failing immune system. 2 days ago, the mouse next door stopped moving. You too were deeply exhausted. To be honest, just surviving was draining all your energy. Then came the pain tolerance tests. Tiny injections, sharp pinches, and small cuts tested your pain threshold. The researchers recorded every reaction in detail. After that torment, you were placed into a food restriction trial. Your meal with harsher shocks and invasive surgery. You saw their panic, their despair, clearly. Terrified, you stared wide-eyed across the lab. A rabbit was strapped down, undergoing eye stimulation tests. Their cries broke your heart. In another room, you saw a dog injected repeatedly, undergoing invasive procedures. His howls echoed down the halls. Unforgettable. A monkey gazed blankly at the bars, enduring psychological and neurological tests. They were being pushed to the very edge. Watching their suffering only deepened your own fear. You realized your pain was just one small part of a much bigger, darker system. Sometimes you overheard humans talking, complex justifications, necessary research, scientific progress, greater good. Their tone shifted from calm detachment to slight unease. You could feel it, a lingering sense of guilt in the air. But no matter how they rationalized it, your anxiety and suffering didn't lessen. Sometimes you caught bits of arguments between researchers. Some questioned the ethics of inflicting pain. Isn't there another way? Others insisted it was a necessary evil for breakthroughs. They pointed out past discoveries built on animal pain. You once overheard a young scientist excitedly discussing computer simulations that could replace live animals someday. But the older scientists dismissed the idea. Unrealistic, they said. Real biology can't be fully simulated. You sighed quietly, wishing they'd speed up progress, or test on themselves first. The researchers seemed satisfied with your progress. You stood out in their data. But sadly, your own life expectancy was never part of their calculations. At 9 months old, you already felt ancient. Wild mice might live 2 years, but here, retirement wasn't part of your benefits package. The lab grew quiet. Maybe it was the weekend. Humans had rest days, you didn't. Fewer visitors came by. Cleaning was less frequent, feeding too. You lived with 3 other mice who had seemingly lost the will to live. Just when you thought it was over, you were moved again, this time to a behavioral study. They wanted to see how isolation affects mental health. You were placed in a lonely cage, far from any other living thing. The silence and boredom drove you to repeat the same behaviors. Pacing, over-grooming, chewing your own fur just to feel something. In another room, you noticed humans watching a mouse wearing a tiny sensor vest. Suddenly, a snake-like robot appeared, a predator. The mouse panicked. His desperation was perfectly recorded by the vest. Humans documented daily predator stress responses, creating charts of mental collapse. Watching that horror, you realized you wouldn't escape it either. Your final experiment involved glowing chemicals. You became famous in a paper titled "Mouse Response to Radioactive Compounds." After the experiment, you lost your appetite. Your strength faded. Even other mice began avoiding you. You were barely over a year old. Patches of fur missing, eyes dull, movements slow. The scientists scribbled final notes. Their interest in you faded as fast as your health. You watched other animals taken away. Mice, rabbits, monkeys, never to return. Your cage was moved to a corner, labeled "Completed Study." Days slipped by in darkness. Each breath grew weaker. You had endured countless trials, endless tests and mazes, etched into your fading memory, and in the end, you were quietly discarded. Your contribution was a data point on a graph few would ever read. A lab mouse's life, it turns out, was never about living, only about enduring. You closed your tired eyes as your reluctant journey as a tiny scientific hero finally came to an end. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to this channel. A like, a share, or even a comment can help more people reflect on the silent lives behind the scenes. Thank you for watching. From both me and all the little lives we often overlook.